You've met our panelists today. Where is Lance? Lance Harcher. He's our third panelist. I think at one point or the other, you've all been introduced to Zora from Novo Nordisk. We have Dr. Andrea Cervi from Windsor Regional Health Systems, and we have Lance Harcher, who will be joining the panelist team very soon. Just to be mindful of time, this is one session that I tell you I'm always excited about because this is one session where we have candid discussion among, industry partners, clinicians, and patients, right? Helping us to better understand perspectives and what our expectations are, what are the gaps, and what we need to do together. So for today's session, we're looking at pathways to patient access to innovative therapies. And so over this weekend, we've been talking about innovative therapies. So what are the pathways that would take us there? So this is what this discussion is about. We have some questions for our amazing panelists, and I'm going to start with Dr. Andrea Cervi. Dr. Andrea Cervi, being an healthcare provider, serving patients with sickle cell disease in Windsor area, do you think that patients are accessing innovative therapies enough? If not, what are the barriers you noticed? Thank you.
So thanks, Lanre, so much for the question. I hope I'm projecting okay back there. Okay, thank you. I would say no. I don't think that patients in our region are accessing novel therapies enough. There are some strides that we've made. So we do have a pathway for referral for allogeneic stem cell transplantation, and so we work with both London and Toronto for that program. But in terms of other additional novel disease-modifying therapies, we really do find it challenging. And I think there's a number of barriers. I think there's lack of provider awareness sometimes of novel therapies. I think there's lack of access from a finances perspective. My clinic is entirely based in the cancer center, and so it's such a stark contrast because we have so much support for our patients with oncologic issues, and we have, lots of talks from different pharmaceutical representatives, and we have an entire drug access navigator team that helps us to gain access to newer therapies for patients. And then when it comes to sort of my hemoglobinopathy side of clinic, we have none of those supports, none of those infrastructures in place, and that makes it a huge challenge. And I would say one of the other issues too is that for some novel therapies that are not administered by mouth, so intravenous therapies, we have no place to organize for provision of those therapies either. So even if we were to theoretically gain access, we don't have a pathway in place to actually facilitate those medications. So I would say those are sort of the three barriers. But with the help of Lanre and SCAGO, we are getting funding in our region, and I hope in time that we would get something like a drug access navigator team to help, similar to how we're doing this with our oncology population.
Thank you so much. I would like you to pass it to Lance. I'm going to ask Lance the same question. As someone with lived experience with sickle cell disease, you live in Hamilton area.
I do.
And I'm wondering, do you think, not just in half of Hamilton, but across the province, do you think that patients with sickle cell disease are accessing innovative therapies enough? And if you don't think they are, what are the barriers? Thank you.
Yeah. I actually think that they are not accessing novel therapies enough. I think barriers for me can be categorized as patient-related barriers, but also physician-related barriers. I think sometimes we hear about how patients in particular, they have a hard time communicating with physicians, and so for that reason, not a lot of patients are getting insight into these novel therapies or innovative treatment approaches that they can benefit from. I also think about there just being a general mistrusting of what we know to be true about science and medicine for many folks, and that has gone in the way of their interest in accessing these. Financially, we know that so many patients have patients with sickle cell disease in particular, the disease burden and the cost associated with just making sure that they can afford and tap into these treatments is also something worth considering as a barrier. So in general, I would just label the barriers to be patient-related, whether it's even their beliefs about the effectiveness. So many of them might think that this might not be a good fit for me for many different reasons, and then also just considering the relationship that they may have with physicians who may not necessarily be introducing these treatments.
Great thoughts, Lance, and I'm going to come back to you. Just hold on to those thoughts that you have. But I want to ask Zoraida, as an industry, partner, a question to say, given what you've heard about patients not getting enough access to innovative therapies, as industry partner, how do you think pharmaceutical companies could drive patient access to innovative therapies?
Thank you for the question, and I would like first to thank you for having me here at this summit. I believe it's my fourth also and the first in person, so really happy to be here and privileged. That being said, and I know it's been highlighted during the entire summit that access means also different things to different people. It's also different perspectives. So as a pharma industry, access means that we are working towards making sure that the patient have access to the medicine we produce. That being said, for sickle cell disease in Canada, unfortunately, there is still no approved therapy. And so we're trying to pave the way, understand first and hear from the different stakeholders and the different players, government, payers, of course the patients at the center of it, the patient organizations, the providers, just trying to understand and map that path and pathway for us to advocate and make sure that we are working towards making our medicines and the ones that we produce accessible to patient. Now to patients, sometimes access means, and we've heard it also, access to care. We are having dedicated people internally, and it's been also highlighted this morning that diversity also has to be in the leadership teams and the people who decide and the decision makers. So we do have, as the new kid in the block, because we're very new in the hemoglobinopathy field, trying to surround ourselves with people who comes from that field. We have a patient engagement team now that is working with the patient communities across the globe. We do have expertise within from the healthcare providers as well. And we're also having in the ground people who are trying to meet with the patients, the patient organizations, the physicians as well, to try to understand, making sure that with the expertise that we have in rare disease, in rare bleeding disorders and rare endocrine disorders, we can identify the issues so that we can lend that expertise in addressing the issues that we have, even though we're doing it years away from any commercialized product, at least for Novo Nordisk.
I think you've actually answered my second question, but I just want to make sure I ask you if you have any additional comment on how Novo Nordisk in particular, which is your pharmaceutical company, is involving patients in discussions to know what patients want. Like, how do you do that? Thank you.
Thank you. So it starts internally, I believe, and it starts when having the right people and the right teams dedicated to the cause. And so we are fortunate enough to have a patient engagement team now who is doing a lot of work with the patient organizations across the globe once again. we talked a lot about clinical trials, and we talked a lot about including patient voice in protocol designs. So this is what Novo Nordisk is trying to do right now, is involving the patients in roundtable discussions, in lived experienced experts roundtables and meetings to identify, listen. I heard a lot the word listen. I think Ms. Fitzanne Howell also said, equity means listening to us, start with us, include us, and so listen deeply as well. I believe Mr. Paul Bailey also talked about listening deeply. So that's what we are trying to do with this team. In Canada, we're also going to run patient roundtable discussions, making sure that we include the patient not only in the design of clinical trials, but also in the strategies that we hope to put in place that will fit the needs of the community. So that is also something that we are doing. On the clinical trial front, we ran in between 2022 and 2023 a survey that we called the Listen Survey, and it's been presented in ASH conference last year. So if I have half a minute, I can tell you a little bit more about. And this is the learning and insights into sickle cell clinical trial experiences. And so this survey included more than 1,000 patients with sickle cell disease and more than 361, I believe, healthcare providers across 17 countries, of which Canada participated with 16 healthcare providers and 76 patients. The interim findings have been presented at the ASH conference last year, and we found out or identified some systemic issues that we still hear about that have been highlighted about the importance of awareness, education, involvement in the clinical trial, learning from the peers, knowing that there are some innovative medicines that we can access to, and some disconnect sometimes between the healthcare system and the patient needs, or I think I've heard also today the difference in agendas. That being said, the interim findings helped us emphasize or highlight what we knew, and now we're in the process of having other analyses by group, by genders, by countries, so that we make sure that once we have the Canadian data, we can come back to you and present to the community, share back what they have been contributing with, and then we can co-create and co-develop with the patients and the communities actionable recommendations to actually try to involve as soon as possible the patients in the strategies and the decisions and the activities we put in place.
Wow. Before we go to the next questions, I want to ask the audience, does anybody has any question for our panelists at this point? Before we continue? Any comment, any questions to the panelists? If none, thank you. I think we're all enjoying the discussion. That's awesome. So I'm going to go back to Lance, and I'm going to ask Lance, from what you know, how can we ensure that more patients in Canada have access to innovative therapies?
Mm-hmm. I think the first thing that we need to do is make sure that the treatment that's being developed is what the patients need. And that would mean that making sure that the agenda aligns. I think it's really important that we give consideration to not just the fact that sickle cell disease is a blood disorder, and so we are trying to address the hemoglobin aspect of things. We have to think about how it's a multi-system disorder and how that impacts functioning. And so that will first give us the being able to co-develop so that we're on the same page. And then we have to also make sure that we are making it cost effective. I really think that many of the innovative therapies that's being created, designed, it's out there, and we know that it's expensive, but I feel like we have to start talking about advocating for it to be accessible to folks in ways that we know that they can afford it. It's really hard for patients to hear about these amazing treatments and what they will do, but then they hear about the astronomical costs associated with it and just suddenly feeling disheartened again because they cannot benefit from that. So how do we go about doing that? Community organizations, policymakers, government, private sector need to lobby, come together so that we can make sure that our patients can actually afford these treatments.
Thank you. If you can pass it to Dr. Cervi, I'd like you to address the same question. Thank you.
I have a difficult time saying it more eloquently than Lance, and I think he's highlighted all of the points. Really, I think on a day-to-day in the clinic, it's the accessibility issue is always, I think, the first challenge is we have the same level of disappointment knowing that there are these agents that are out there that could help, and yet there's no access to them, and there's no ways of actually getting them, which is definitely disheartening and disappointing on a day-to-day basis. I don't know that I could really identify other issues aside from what Lance said, but I think for me a takeaway too is it is important to engage your patients because we do like to focus on numbers in hematology. We're a numbers type of people, but it's beyond just sort of improving things in a lab perspective, and also having these therapies that are improving function and improving different aspects. And sickle cell disease is so multifaceted, so truly there are so many opportunities to work on improving the day-to-day for our patients, and I think the most practical barrier that I really face on a day-to-day is just that accessibility issue. These medications are just costly, and I've not been able to access them in my time in independent practice, unfortunately.
I see. Thank you so much for that response. I wanted to say that access is one thing, but I also feel that patients sometimes are also, they wanted to know more about innovative therapies and cures and stuff like that. We did a survey when Cardiff and INIS, which are the reimbursement agencies, put out some innovative cures through Health Canada that were in Canada that were presented to them. They were asking patient organizations like ours, how do we feel about it, and so on and so forth. We did a survey of our community, and the community was happy that there is curative therapy, but at the same time, they wanted to know more about side effects and long-term effects of those therapies and so on and so forth. I'm wondering about your take on how should we be, when there are innovative therapies available or about to be made available, what steps should be taken in ensuring that patient community are well educated about these therapies, in advance. So, Lance, I would like you to take that first. Sorry to put you in the spot.
No problem, Ms. Lanre. Well educated. What comes to mind is we have to ensure that the developers are coming back to the community at every step of the way, but not just communicating it in one mode, for example, by sending a pamphlet, for example. We need to increase education by tapping into the different ways people can digest information very well, including audio and visual, and just making sure that patients and member community liaisons or even partners are just constantly being aware of where we are in the process and understanding the language around the development of this treatment and what it means. Side effects we know are really important to consider, and some of us experience fear and anxiety if we do not understand what it really means for you to describe something as, I don't know the jargon, but I'm just simply saying that maybe just making sure that the language matches that of the community, something that they can truly resonate with. And it's presented to them in ways that they can digest very well.
And when should we be doing that? The education, the awareness, at what stage? Would that be when this therapy is presented to regulatory bodies, or should it be before, or should it be after? When do you think it would be more effective to present these resources to the patient community?
Yeah, I actually think it's an iterative process. It's every step of the journey, and we keep going back and forth, making sure that we are communicating effectively, they are receiving the message well, and that requires getting feedback from them. So I wouldn't limit it to maybe at the beginning or at the end or in the middle. I think it requires just gradually keeping at it. Every time we discover something new, every time we thought this would have been the results we wanted, but it wasn't, every time we have this new insight into what is going on along the process, it should be communicated.
Thank you very much. I will pass it to Dr. Cervi if you have additional comments on that question. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, all things that I could think to add again to Lance's wonderful and comprehensive comments there. Other things to consider too, I think is always helpful if you're able to integrate into these sessions patients who have actually gone through the experience as well. So either patients who have participated in clinical trials, because then they're giving lived experience and they can speak directly to what they encountered and maybe barriers that on the clinician side of things maybe we didn't even actually realize. So I think integrating people who have gone through some of these novel therapeutic strategies is helpful. I definitely agree. I think it's an iterative process. I think that when novel therapies are coming out, there should be education and awareness from the conception, from the establishment, and then on an ongoing fashion so that we can continue to ensure that people are educated and they're aware and they're becoming more familiar. And I think integrating different forms of education, not just in pamphlet, but also videos and sessions. I think, all of that really helps to work together to enhance a person's sort of familiarity and comfort with these new things once they are coming out, so they don't seem so novel and scary necessarily.
Thank you very much. And I'll pass it to Zoraida. As a farmer representative, having heard the comments from Dr. Cervi and Mr. Lance, soon to be Dr. Lance, I'm so excited. How do you, what would you say to what they have said in terms of when should we be educating the community to allay fears? Because I know that's one thing that came out in our survey strongly was, great to have curative therapies, but we are worried and we would like to know more about side effects and long-term effects and stuff like that. How do we work towards that to allay the fears? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And the comment and the thought that I had in mind was hearing here to the insights is the first thing, and maybe some step that is crucial, is clinical trials. Clinical trials offer that avenue to both the clinician, but also to the patient to know more about what's out there in terms of innovative therapies. And so as a company, Novo Nordisk, that is also a member of Innovative Medicines Canada, we do also, although we would like to interact directly, with the patients and run in learning programs to tell you more about what we are developing, we're also bound by the rules that that lead us to interact with the healthcare professionals first. So when we offer any clinical trials or when we are developing, as we are doing right now, two molecules for sickle cell disease and hopefully thalassemia, we also go to the physicians and the experts, and so that's where kind of the knowledge sharing is happening. And so that would be the bridge to the patients in terms of this is what is out there. These are the considerations, the safety also considerations, so on and so forth. In the Listen survey that I told you about earlier, we did identify that knowing about long-term safety effect was one of the major factors and sometimes barriers into clinical trial participation. So making sure that also the treating physician, the healthcare provider knows about the molecule, knows about the protocol, and have that ability to relay that message to the patient is crucial, and that's something that we are hoping to work with the physicians on.
Thank you, Zoraida. I also like you to keep the mic. Given that with sickle cell disease, while we would love every patient to be seen by a hematologist in a comprehensive care setting, we do know that some of our patients sometimes just see primary care physicians. Is there any work to also engage, primary care physicians for them to be aware of what is in the pipeline, what is out there, so they can also work with their patients and give them this information? Thank you.
It's a very good question, and that's something that we are seeing with some, healthcare providers that do want to be that bridge actually with the primary care providers, so that they can, be ambassadors, be the trainers, and build learning programs toward targeted and tailored towards primary healthcare providers, so that they can not 100% pass the torch to them, but at least work together so that they can alleviate some of the burden on the healthcare system. There is nothing formal right now, or at least not some that I've been aware of on Novo Nordisk, but there are some discussions around that we've heard for sure. The way industry can support is supporting those learning programs for healthcare providers by healthcare providers.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks, Lanre. The patients who are in major centers, they get doctors who are doing the research. So there is a lot of information there, or at least there is information if they want to seek that. But those who live in the centers with small numbers of patients, and those who live in remote areas like Northern Ontario, rural Alberta, rural Nova Scotia, how do they expect them to know? Like when I talk to patients, they're like, we don't know this is happening. We didn't know this is happening. Not everybody lives in Montreal, Toronto, or Vancouver, or Calgary. So that's a big challenge, and it's a big concern. And even hematologists at those smaller centers, they don't have the time to sit down and answer questions. That's if they are aware of I'm sure they are aware of the research that's happening, but do they have the time? Can they answer all the questions? Research coordinators are more in those big centers as well. So how are we gonna overcome that? I know the patient organizations have a big role in that, but how we can all address it together as clinicians, researchers, industry, and patient advocates.
Thank you, Ria.
Thank you for the question. As I was saying, for Novo Nordisk particularly, we're very new in the field. So we are really in the process of listening again and learning and identifying those issues. That's not an excuse. It's really what we are in the process of doing. Internally, that's what I hear maybe 100 times a day, which I have to say frustrates me sometimes, but that's the reality. We need to listen, because I'd like to have more actions, right? The molecules that we are developing are still in phase 2, 3, and so we're not launching anything yet in Canada. But we are trying to do it right, and the way we know we can do it right is really by listening again and including the people who are affected with those issues, because they would know more and they know best. That being said, I think it's a partnership, right, in making sure that these information are relayed everywhere across Canada. And I believe it's also working in partnership with SCAGO, patient organizations across all provinces of Canada, clinicians, of course, and physician organization, professional organization such as CanHIM or the Thalassemia Foundation. That's the way I believe we can do it, because pharma industry cannot do it on its own. I believe that we can do it hand in hand. What it would look like, what shape or form, I think that's yet to be developed together again.
Thank you so much, Zoraida. I wanted to add that I have been participating in discussions around barriers and this kind of discussions for some time. And one thing that I'm going to say that over and over, and I keep saying, is that we cannot focus just on the tertiary centers as where patients will get information. It's great, but that is only one avenue. There needs to be other avenues that patients can get information about clinical trials, what is out there, what can I tap into, and so on and so forth. And as a matter of fact, in Ontario, given that now we are working with Ontario Health and the ministry to bring health to community health center level, so which is where open patients would then be able to get care close to home in their own community health centers, and then that community health center can then work with the tertiary institution for patients to then get, maybe once a year comprehensive care, or if they need to go to emerge, they would then go then, but at least they can get, the day-to-day care close to home. I think we need to look at the strategy. Again, I don't think anything's written in stone. You can go back and look at our policies. And I think I love what you say, listen. Like, that is amazing, because look at what patients are saying, what the communities are saying, how they want to access information, who they go to, and utilize those avenues that patients are already there. They are being seen by their primary care physician. They are engaged with their community organizations. They are there with the community centers. And how do we leverage all of this, right, to effectively inform? If these individuals have to be trained, let's train them. Let's do what we need to do, but let's make information more accessible for the patients that need them.
If I may add one point that I wanted to highlight is with regards to how we make sure that patient voice is heard also by regulatory bodies. And oftentimes when you file for a product, and so you submit everything data, clinical trials, pivotal trials, phase 3 data, phase 2 data, so on and so forth. And a lot of times we do also have patient-reported outcomes. And patient-reported outcomes is basically also capturing the patient voice. But it's often overlooked because it is considered all the scales that we use are subjective. And when I think about that, I also think about how one individual will rate his level of pain versus another. And so how we can make sure that these patient-reported outcomes are heard, because they are very valid. It might be different for other disease states, but they are really important in sickle cell disease. So one other, topic that we're trying also to advocate for with regulatory bodies is how we make sure that these patient-reported outcomes, that this data that we've been collecting through clinical trials, randomized, controlled, everything, pivotal trials are heard, validated, valid, because they are really valid.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We appreciate that. Still with you. I'm so sorry I'm giving you a lot of questions here. Is there anything in the pipeline from your company that you would like to share with the community?
I'd like to share a lot, actually. Not that I can, but I will try to share what has already been published, obviously, and presented. So Novo Nordisk is developing 2 disease-modifying therapies. Not as excited as gene therapy, but nonetheless really also important in the treatment care of patients. So these 2 molecules, as I said earlier, are in phase 2, phase 3. One is more advanced than the other. One has been presented by Dr. Yves Pastor yesterday, which is etavopivat, that's a pyruvate kinase activator. And the second is an epigenetic fetal hemoglobin inducer. So hydroxyurea. This is also the same class of treatment. And these 2 medications are still in development, right? Very much so. So we're hoping to have more clinical data that we can share with the community on these 2 molecules, but they are for etavopivat in both sickle cell disease and thalassemia, both TDT and TDT for thalassemia, so transfusion-dependent and transfusion-independent patients. And for the second molecule that is called NDEC, is for sickle cell disease patients.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's pass it to Dr. Cervi. And I promise you that this is your last question. I promise. As a clinician, how would you advise other clinicians in supporting and helping patients to access innovative therapies?
That's a great question. I guess I would speak to the point that was made in the corner here. So I do practice in a smaller community setting, and it's challenging. I think what I've relied on is, support from SCAGO, support from Lanre. We've been, granted access to a lot of things that I know we would not have were it not for the support of SCAGO and our partnership with our tertiary care academic center as well. I think really for us in Windsor, that partnership is with London Health Sciences Center with Dr. Soul, and that helps to keep our program up to date. It helps to ensure that I'm also up to date and that I'm able to accurately educate our patients. And through that, we're just promoting more continuing medical education opportunities too, because we do have trainees that percolate through our center, and we also are a referring center to smaller community hospitals within our region. So it's just about sort of venues, grand rounds, opportunities to promote broader awareness, I think. But again, for myself personally, it's having those relationships with SCAGO, with CanHEM, and our referral center as well.
Well said, thank you. And I'll pass it to Lance. As someone with lived experience and very seasoned, a researcher yourself, what advice would you have for people with sickle cell disease and their families in accessing innovative therapies, in accessing clinical trials, and in learning more about, sickle cell disease in general? Thank you.
I'd say ask questions. It's very important that when it comes on to wellness, that we develop a comfort in seeking information. And that means being comfortable asking the family doctor what is out there, connecting to community organizations, connecting with peers so that we have this information sharing and we are getting it from people we trust, people who are reliable or who has reliable information. I know that within the community, support is really important, and it means that we need to have clinicians who are supportive. And I do hear you, Dr. Cervi, about how it can be really challenging to work in a small setting, and then you have a lot of patients to see. I so wish that we can really zone in on a multidisciplinary care team so that we can have even social workers and psychologists, folks who have really excellent communication style so that patients can talk to them and develop that comfort in getting information so that they can access it. I also think, too, that community organizations have a really important role in the dissemination of information to the patient community. I think that it's important that they know that their role involves advocacy, but also making sure that the information that's being disseminated is reliable and clear. So,
Thank you. And is there any questions from the... Wonderful, thank you.
Hello, Donnell Ivy. I'm from the U.S. originally, and all my experience with sickle cell disease is kind of U.S. focused. I know you said earlier that access to care is one of the big issues for sickle cell patients in Canada. I'm trying to understand what that access to care burden is. In the U.S., you have pockets that are very rural, Alabama, Mississippi, that have high sickle cell patient concentration. So getting to a center that has a hematologist that does sickle cell could be like a 3-hour drive or more. But in Canada, one, I have to just admit that I don't have as much knowledge about the sickle cell community. From what I can tell, it seems that it's mainly concentrated around Hamilton, Toronto, and Montreal, even though I don't know if that's true or not. Is the issue with access to care, is it more around payment for drugs? I think I heard recently that hydroxyurea is not even approved. So is it around, approvals? Is it government? Could you describe what you feel is the biggest problem with access to care in Canada?
I'm wondering if Dr. Cervi wants to take that first.
Thank you. Oh my, okay. I think it's all of the above, to be very honest with you. I think, access to medications, it's cost. That's the financial aspect is a barrier, and then it is what you say. There are the larger tertiary care centers where the research is happening and where the multidisciplinary teams are. But we know that the reality in Canada is that the majority of care happens in community care settings, and those are the settings that are not resourced to actually provide the care that needs to happen, and so I'd say there's even lack of awareness in our own region that there are people that are trained hematologists that will provide care to patients with hemoglobinopathies, but it's not broadly known among patients. It's not broadly known among the primary care specialists that are taking after these patients as well. So it's the resources that do exist. There needs to be more of them. There needs to be more people within those centers, and there needs to be more awareness that those centers exist for the patients in the region and the providers who are taking care of those patients. That's a little tiny insight. Lance will have more, I'm sure.
I actually want to add the issue of race and minority status and how I think that plays a role in distorting the access to care. I really believe that research has shown that among other chronic illnesses, there is more funding available for certain conditions and much less for sickle cell disease, despite we're having a larger population of sickle cell disease patients, and in Canada, that is. And so it makes me think about health disparity within that context as well. So in addition to, just being very stretched, I also think that our priority has been off, or those of policymakers specifically, because the data is showing that here we have this great need, but yet more is being invested in other areas, not to discount that those aren't important, but also just looking at how sickle cell disease specifically has been overlooked for a really long time. So.
Thank you, Lance. And I want to add a few comments to that, too. So you asked a few questions. I don't know if I remember everything, but in terms of where are people with sickle cell disease, they're all over Canada. You'll find them in more in certain parts, for instance, in Scarborough. You'll find them in the Gin and Finch, like in Toronto area. However, again, with the high cost of living in Toronto, many are moving to suburbs, so sickle cell patients are all over. So that's one thing. And this is why I think to Dr. Xavier Lance, I can't remember who made the comment, it's very important then that people have access wherever they are, close to home, because they're just not concentrated just in one part, but people are moving due to high cost of living and all of that, to where they can have affordability. And again, as we know, healthcare in Canada is provincial. So it's province by province. And I like what Lane says earlier. Patient organizations has a lot to do. Advocacy is a big part of what we need to do. In different provinces, if we're able to advocate, we will get results. As Dr. Andrea Cervi said, a lot of patients are going to hospitals that are close to home, but these hospitals might not have the resources